All right, welcome to another episode of CinePresto. Today I'm here with John Morton, John Morton,
Yeah, that'll work.
right?
Yeah. Or Dak.
Or Dak, exactly, that's where I was going.
Or Bespin Boba, either way.
And he's done a lot of work on the Star Wars trilogy, primarily during Empire days, right?
It was all in Empire Strikes Back.
Right, yeah. So we're here to just at Silicon. I'm not going to get used to it. It's like, it used to be Silicon Valley Comic Con, but now it's Silicon, right? So, but just to talk a little bit about his experiences in film, he's done a lot of other movies as well.
Mm-hmm.
We talked extensively about, just you being in the military as well previously, right? So,
Yeah.
But it's kind of an open conversation today.
Sure.
It's not really like I'm trying to point you towards like, oh, we're going to talk more Star Wars stuff, whatever seems to interest you, because I just thought you were a cool guy to talk to, honestly. So and that's kind of just the feel of my
We can talk about anything: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness,
all of the above, right?
or the Force.
That's how we do it here. Yeah. Oh, and the Force is kind of like all the above, right?
Yeah. There you go.
All right, so how did you get involved with all this? I guess the obvious thing, you've got the Clone Wars Gennady Tartakovsky Yoda from 2003. It's my favorite series, okay? How did you get involved with Star Wars?
You mean in originally or doing the conventions?
Originally, let's go originally.
Well, at the time in the 70s, I was an actor in London and also doing lighting and sound on the side. So I was in show business. Mm-hmm. Working primarily in London theater. And I was in a show that was a musical that required a folk singing guitar player with an American accent. Mm-hmm. And I got cast in this, and the musical became a smash hit, and it went into the West End, which is London's Broadway. Mm-hmm. And picked up an agent and a union card. And the agent said, well, John, you're not really a stage actor, are you? And I said, no, not really. And she said, but I think you do well in film. And so she reckoned that she could make a good living out of me, in the film business.
As all agents.
Yeah. So she put me up for A Bridge Too Far. And I was cast in that film in 1976. And so once you get in the system, you're off and running. And so in 1979, I did the casting call through Maggie Parker, my agent, and went to see Irene Lamb, who was casting all sort of the under 5 roles. And Irene said, "Yeah, I think you'll be good." And so the next thing that happened is I got a call from the agent saying, "Okay, you're cast as a rebel pilot in Empire Strikes Back." So I showed up on the set, expecting to work for 2 days, and on a daily rate, which was very generous. And as soon as I arrived, they said, "Okay, you're going to be Dak, who is Mark Hamill's co-pilot." Mm-hmm. And I went, "Oh, man, that's fantastic." And they said, "Well, not so fast. You're already dead." They'd just come back from Norway and Finse, where they had filmed the exteriors, mm-hmm. And so a Norwegian extra took the hit for me. So I was a little disappointed about that, but on the other hand, I realized that people will remember, Luke Skywalker's co-pilot, right, so it would be a good thing.
Yeah. The opening 30 minutes right of the film, it's quite a while, so
yeah.
Who doesn't remember that?
So there were a lot of people on the film that I'd worked with in other films before, and it was like a great reunion of actors and technicians. And it was a great experience, and because they were having so many difficulties technically with the filming, instead of doing 2 days work on my daily rate, I ended up working 4 weeks on my daily rate. So I don't mind saying that I made more money on that film alone in 4 weeks than I made the whole previous year, because it was a very generous, high-paid, privilege, and they were sort of stuck with me, and that explains actually why I got into playing Boba Fett, because the same thing had happened with Jeremy Bulloch. Because of the delays, and he had been booked to do 2 days work on a film, and there was a conflict, and so Dave Tomlin and Steve Lanning, who were the first and second assistant directors, knew I was a team player from working with me previously, and said, "Hey, John, would you, since we're paying you, would you mind stepping in for Jeremy, since you're about the same size, so he can go off and do another film?" And I said, "Sure." Didn't know what I was getting into. So the night before, when Jeremy was leaving, I went into his dressing room and I said, "Hey, man, you know, how am I supposed to play this character? I don't know anything about him." And he said, "Think Clint Eastwood. Fistful of dollars, play everything slow and menacing," and that's exactly what I did. So we had that scene where Boba says to Vader, "He's no good to me, dead." And at the time, I really didn't understand the significance, but you know, a lifetime since, I look back on it and I say, you know, Preston, what happened there was that I ended up playing this iconic scene where a character, Boba Fett, stands down Darth Vader and says, "Hey, do it my way," and lives to tell the tale. And unless you can tell me otherwise, I don't think there's anybody else in the Star Wars galaxy that
I think it was Tarkin before me, but you know,
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
dead, right?
yeah,
So at
yeah.
that point, yeah.
So that was pretty cool.
From one masked man to another, right? At that point.
Yeah.
You have to have a mask before you can
Yeah.
get your Vader, I can challenge Vader card, so.
You mentioned Tarkin. I live in Annapolis, Maryland now, and one of my dear friends is also a Star Wars personality, James Lucino, who wrote the book Tarkin. And Jimmy's just a great guy, and he and I have become very good friends. And his story is kind of interesting. He started life out as the bass player for Manhattan Transfer, and then ended up, you know, writing books, and was contracted to write several of the Star Wars novels. But just a terrific guy with a whole wealth of information and experiences, and so I've got somebody to hang with in my local corner of the world, which is kind of fun.
So you moved to so you lived in the UK for most.
Yeah, all the time when I was doing the films and most of my theater work, I was based in London and loved it. I mean, I sort of came of age there, but I'd gone back and forth with my family previously. So I was in London in the 60s, in the swinging London era of the Beatles and so forth. But not to live, but to visit, either at Christmases or in the summer. And so I experienced a little bit of that, and I knew that after I got out of the Navy and finished my schooling, that I really wanted to start my career there. I did, and it was an amazing run, I have to say. And what brought me back to the United States was I had a film that was in development in Los Angeles, which alas didn't make it. It got caught up in the writers and directors strike of 1981. And I ran out of money, so I went back with my first wife to New York and set up there for about 4 years, and then finally said, I've had enough of this, and moved down to Washington and Annapolis, which is where I've been ever since. But I still have a house over in Wiltshire, in the West Country in England, which I rent. And I have every intention of maybe, settling there in full retirement. But I don't know. We'll see where it goes. I mean, there's still a lot going on.
Still the journey, right?
Still the journey, yeah.
As you kind of talked a little bit about, too, just to bring it back just a little bit, we talked a little bit about how, you had a real chance to bond with Mark Hamill on set, just being of the similar, military, Navy brat you're mentioning in the family. So.
Well, Navy Junior is the appropriate term.
Okay, Navy Junior, yeah.
You have Army brats.
Army brats.
And
yes,
Navy Junior.
But,
yeah.
And then, on top of that, you also had the opportunity to interact with, Gary Curtis, who doesn't always seem to get, a lot of credit for, being that producer role and really kind of grounding the characters, right? Could you speak a little bit to, I guess, your experiences with just everyone you had the chance to work with on that set?
Well, since you mentioned Mark and Gary, let's, sort of start off there. Mark and I discovered that we had in common fathers who were both naval officers, career naval officers, but of a certain kind. And anybody that knows the Navy will recognize the notion of being a destroyer man. And the destroyers in the Navy are the smaller ships. and they're the greyhounds of the sea. And in fact, I think, you got Tom Hanks's movie, Greyhound, okay? And the thing about that is they're smaller ships, and it's much more of a family community, and at a younger age, they, the officers have much more responsibility, and they're tighter with their crew and so forth. And so both my dad and Mark's dad, liked to be known as destroyermen, as opposed to serving on aircraft carriers or cruisers and things like that. But the real thing that we shared as well was the experience of being moved around so much and going to innumerable schools and always being the new kid on the block, right. Which is kind of tough because you got to prove yourself and you got to force yourself to be an extrovert to kind of fit in. Yeah. And so I think Mark, at that time in his life, was, he was thrust into stardom, but he was still a regular guy. Right. Yeah. And he probably still is that way. I've seen him once since at Celebration 6, but not enough to have time to talk to him. So he was very approachable and just wanted to have lunch with me every day, pretty much. And we were on the same schedule, and so I got to know him pretty well, and we got to hang out a lot. And occasionally we were joined by Dave Prowse, where I got to know him at that point. And also a guy named Chris Malcolm, who was one of the Rebel pilots, would join us occasionally. And then a dear friend of mine, Eugene Lipinski, who was one of the Rebels.
Let's go back a little bit. Just, you got to have lunch with, Mark and
yeah, so, we talked a lot about, a lot of things, and needless to say, I'd ask him the questions like, well, what are you doing when I don't see you? I mean, you're working on new scenes and all. And, oh, well, I can't really talk too much about that. Yeah. Okay. What can you say? I mean, we hear that there's this new character that you're working with on, that soundstage over there that we can't get into. Right. Yeah. He said, oh, yeah. Well, what's the deal with this character? Well, I can't really tell you. Well, what's the character like? Oh, he's going to be great. Well, what's he like? And he said, well, he's sort of like Kermit the Frog. Yeah. Kermit the Frog, okay. And so, and he lives on this planet that's a swamp planet, sort of like a swamp. Okay.
Did you imagine, like, however many years later you'd be wearing him on your hat, like, all the time?
So, so Mark, in filmmaking, if you're in an under 5 role or, a smaller character, and if there's no need for you to have a full script. It's not like you need the script to understand.
Especially on Empire, because it was so hyped up too, and everyone knows the thing about how only Mark and then George.
So I had sides, as they're called. So that's all I knew about it. But of course, Mark, had the whole script, but we didn't see it, obviously. And I don't think it was quite as sensitive in those days as it is now in terms of the secrecy.
There's still only 3 people knew about the reveal,
Yeah, he was, so. But still, it was, you had only a sort of a segmented understanding of what the film was. Right. Everybody was there for the 4 weeks that I was working, except for Alec Guinness. So I never got a chance to meet or work with him. Although subsequently I did work with his son Matthew on a film series, TV series called Oppenheimer with Sam Waterston. Oh wow, that was a fascinating series to work on, BBC series. It came over here and was shown on PBS. And for many years I used to get residuals from all over the place. I made a bundle of money when it was released in Sri Lanka. I got a residual check for £4, I think, which is worth about $8? Yeah. But you'd see these, little checks would kind of come in.
Just spend it on the coffee, right?
Yeah. That was my beer money. But then, now you mentioned also Gary Kurtz, and I'm glad you did, because Gary was really one of the sort of foundational progenitors of the Star Wars series, and he had a great relationship with George, and I gotta say that even though his title was executive producer, and George's was screenwriter, I'm talking about Empire Strikes Back. No, what was George's title?
Well, he did for that one. There
No,
was
he
also another writer.
No, well, there were two
Unfortunately
actually.
passed away.
Yeah, I don't know what George's credit was because the director was Irving Kershner.
Irving Kershner, and then there was obviously.
But Lee Brackett and Larry
Yep.
Kasdan did the script.
Yeah, that's right.
So I don't, it's funny. I don't know how he was credited.
Yeah, probably just.
But the thing is that in the sequences that I was involved in, I was directed by all three. So I had sometimes Gary Kurtz directed, sometimes George himself directed, although he wasn't always at Elstree during that period, but he was a lot. And sometimes I was directed by Irving Kershner, and they all had a very different focus on how they were approaching directing. But the thing I wanted to say about Gary, which is kind of interesting, especially in the context of where we are today with all that's going on in Afghanistan and what have you, Gary was a conscientious objector during the 1960s, which means that he conscientiously objected to all war in any form. And that was kind of a thing that during the Vietnam War, when all men that were 18 or above were classified as for the U.S. for the draft conscription, and Gary had his CO status confirmed. Nevertheless, he was called up, and he was assigned to the Marine Corps and was sent over to Vietnam to be a Marine Corps combat cameraman. So in other words, yeah, he was in combat. He didn't carry a rifle, but he carried a camera. So he had a very profound experience. And he was a very spiritual guy. And if anybody thinks of Gary Kurtz and the pictures that you see of him at that time in his life, he had this kind of beard that kind of hugged his chin. And then he was clean shaven above his lips. He sort of looked like a Methodist minister or a Quaker, what have you. And he might have even been a Quaker. Anyway, so at one of these lunches with Mark, we got into the discussion of the Force, and Mark said, "Well, there's a lot to this. In fact, Gary and George are, having really heated, intense discussions of trying to figure out, how they're going to manage the violence scenes in this movie." And I said, "Whoa!" And he said, "Yeah, they don't want to glorify violence, and." Maybe the studio was putting pressure on them to, ratchet up the stakes or what have you. But Gary was one of those guys that was really pushing back, notwithstanding his experiences in Vietnam. Of this is not going to be a film that's going to glorify violence. And I remember asking Mark. I said, "Well, what's the spiritual thing behind this?" And he said, "I don't know. Maybe he's a Quaker or a Buddhist or something." But so Gary Kurtz kind of brought this to the table, and I think George was sympathetic in some ways. I never had any conversations with George on this. I mean, I only sat down with him once, and I haven't read anything exactly to see where he's coming from in a spiritual direction. But what I will say about Star Wars, unlike any other film I ever was on, is the way that they treated all of us on the set and in the contractually and what have you was exceptional. And it was really, you were honored, you were paid very well, and the morale was extremely high, which isn't to say that the film didn't have its tensions in terms of the budgets and the delays and all of that stuff. So that, as I often like to say, the tea lady was one of the most enthusiastic people. I remember her going around with her tea and offering teas and saying, "Oh, are you having a good time, love? Isn't it wonderful? It's just wonderful. Are you having fun?" And she was really pushing this. The morale was great. And that's because the example came from the top down. I mean, George and Gary looked after all of their people, and it went right the way down to, you know, the guy sweeping up the elephant dung on the circus floor.
Mm-hmm. For my time working at ILM and stuff like that, and I know people that were pre-Disney, right?
Yeah.
They all said something similar about how George ran the company, right?
Yeah.
Is that, you know, call him what you will, you know, for whatever came after, but he looked after the people. That's really what counts. And, you know, I was talking about with my film crew yesterday, it's just that in this business, it's about people first, right? Really.
Absolutely.
It has to be.
Yeah.
Because you don't really have anything after a certain point, you know, other than money, and if you want people to do the work for you, right, you've got to respect them well enough that, you know, you can make it happen.
Well, the example of the Boba Fett, why I ended up playing Boba Fett, is a great illustration of how that applied. Now, look, you have unions involved and you have agents involved whenever you have actors. And so here was Jeremy Bulloch, contracted to play Boba Fett, and somehow because of an issue that the film company was having in terms of the scheduling, a lot of it being the technical problems, it was bumping up against a commitment that he had to do 2 days work on another film, right? George Lucas or Lucasfilm could have said to Jeremy, "Hey, tough luck. Your character is being filmed tomorrow, and you're going to be there because we got you under contract." So there was an issue, all right? But what they said was essentially, you know, well, we don't want to get in the way of your career. You've got an opportunity here, so we'll make it work. Okay. So instead of being, you know, jerks about this, working to rule, and forcing them, you know, they let him go. Okay. Then they had to fill the slot. Okay, so they came around to find somebody who could fill in for Jeremy Bulloch. And they settled on me because they knew me as a sort of a team player, because I had worked on several films with the first AD, and the second AD I'd worked on 3. And they knew I was kind of a team player. So they came to me and they said, "Hey, John, you know, we got you on a daily rate, and for the next few days you're just going to be standing around anyway. So we'd really like you to step in for Jeremy. Can you do that?" And so I said, "Sure." Now, on my side, I could have said, "Hey, no, my contract reads rebel pilot, okay? You got to do it because of the contract. You got to talk to my agent. This has to be negotiated, and you know the union says, you know, all this sort of stuff." So the work to rule thing worked all around. I didn't do that, and the reason why I didn't do that is that, you know, hey, look, you know, I'm working with my friends here.
Right.
It's no skin off my nose. I'm going to be paid. So in other words, the example of the way they made it happen for Jeremy and, you know, made it happen for me, I mean, I suppose if I had said, "No, I don't want to do that," they would have found somebody else. But the example was set so that you wanted to do whatever needed to be done. Just get it done. And this is so much fun anyway. Treat Williams was an actor who was working in London at the time, and he was good friends with Harrison Ford. And he came out, I remember one day when we were doing one of the big scenes, I guess when Carrie was giving the pep talk in front of the Millennium Falcon. We all scrambled to get into our snowspeeders. And he said, "Man, this is so cool. You know, you all are having so much fun. I'd really like to be a part of this." And so somebody said, "Well, why don't you come back tomorrow and we'll put you in a suit." I'm sure that he wasn't paid for this. Nobody ran it through any of the, you know, it was just like, okay, so Treat got suited up as, I think, one of the rebel officers, I can't remember, and just kind of was there, you know, just to be a part of this thing. I mean, that's kind of what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah. It's no, wow.
Yeah.
It's like when you work on a set like that, you know, for that long, the same people, right? You kind of become sort of family, right, to some extent.
Oh, well, most films are like that.
Yeah, precisely.
But the thing about Star Wars, it was huge production at this point. I mean, we're talking massive soundstage that was there, and a lot of people, a lot of money. And in the 1970s, there was a very famous book that was written that was very popular at the time called Small is Beautiful. And it was kind of a book that was, advocating, dimension that was, human, whereas, large organizations, corporations, and large films or whatever, is when things all get screwed up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Star Wars sort of, broke the mold on this, that, I always like to say that it proved that not always small is beautiful. And again, this gets back to a tribute to George and to Gary. The two of them, from the top down said, this is the way it's going to be, and we're going to look after our people. And, we're telling a story that has a spiritual dimension to it, that's got a mythic quality that, good versus evil and what have you. We're going to live into, what the story is all about, what we're preaching. And they did, in my judgment. I mean, I could be looking through it with rose-colored glasses, but, when I think of all the films I worked on, it was one of those films that there was a human quality to it that I can't honestly say was true for other films.
Mm-hmm.
It can be done.
Right.
And it's not necessarily only something that's small that can do, if you're in a big organization, you can run that big organization, the way it should be,
Mm-hmm.
Where it has a human quality and has values.
But then, when you're on these sets, you're on it because to some degree you want to create some sort of magic, right? And then but if you it's the added length, right?
Yeah, that is a little bit of a wishful thinking. I mean,
not always,
when you get down to it,
right.
You're on it because you're getting paid.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, it's a
fair
job.
Enough. But I mean, creative people up top might like to think that, you know what I mean? Right?
Well, I think that. I mean, I got a film that I've got in pre-development on Duke Ellington, and I want it to be an honest thing,
right.
And and so does the Ellington family.
Yeah, I mean, you have to kind of imbue that with that. Obviously there is the money element.
Yeah.
This business is all about balancing the creative and the
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And some people kind of get lost in either one or the other, right?
Yeah.
But if you can find that perfect balance,
Yeah. No. That's very true. I think it's for people that are on the creative side, they went that direction because they want to express something that's has an authenticity or an honesty or what have you, and art. But then there are others that are more attuned to commerce, and I don't know. I mean, you said it beautifully already. Yeah, I mean, you balance it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Did you ever hear about how the original ending to Return of the Jedi was supposed to go very differently?
No.
State of on board or whatnot. So.
No, tell me.
Oh, okay. So the ending is supposed to go originally that Leia is not the sister, right? That was the biggest thing. So there was another character out there that Luke and Leia had to go find before they rescued Han. And obviously the Han thing was mainly because we don't know if Harrison's coming back, right? So they go out and find the sister, and then they have her and Luke, bond throughout the course of the film, go back to confront Vader, and the ending's a lot more bittersweet, where it's more old Western style, where Luke kind of goes off into the sunset and stuff. But yeah, something like that allegedly was supposedly one of the original endings that they were thinking about, and before Ewoks got involved. So, yeah.
Well, isn't it fascinating? I mean,
yeah.
I remember Mark telling me that George's vision was for 9 films.
Yeah.
And so I knew that Star Wars was going to be with us for a long time. And then at other points, people have written that he had it in mind for 12.
12, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then, of course, there is the question as to, well, what was episode 7, 8, and 9 supposed to look like, when he made the sale to...
I would have loved to read those original treatments.
Yeah.
I know those are written. I know they're I think they go 40 each or something like that, and people have read them, but they've said that.
Yeah.
It's Underwater Temple, if I remember correctly, and
I can't...
Stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, and then, of course, there is the issue of the expanded universe where, you had the characters that came out of that were Luke and Leia's sons and daughters and things, and then Mara Jade, who was a character that I know the women in the Star Wars fan community were very, very insistent that was going to be a character that was going to emerge.
Right.
And how I can attest to that was I got to, back in '98, I think it was, I was invited to the Star Ladies, they were called at the time, convention in Washington, D.C., when they were all there for the opening of the Smithsonian exhibition on Star Wars. And I went there and I met with Tim Zahn and his wife, Mike Stackpole, and Mary Franklin, who was eventually became the fan outreach coordinator for Lucasfilm for all the celebrations, was there as the bartender.
Wow. And
she was just getting involved, and then Steve Sansweet showed up. And at that time, he was the fan outreach. His presence there with this group, and I would say there were about 40 people there, and they were all women who were fantastic fans. Some of them were writers and did fan fiction with West End games, and others were like accountants and attorneys, and really dynamic women. And Steve used it as an opportunity for a focus group. And so he was asking them what they wanted, and several things they conveyed to him. They wanted things that were not just toys. They wanted, I remember one woman who was an accountant from Chicago said, "No, I want a leather, brief that I can throw on the table when I have these corporate meetings that has Star Wars, Merrick symbol logo, so that they can see that I'm part of Star Wars, and I want it to be a good quality leather, and all my notes I can take in it, that kind of stuff." I mean, really very mature input. And then when it came to, well, where do you want the series to go? Then everybody stood up and said, Mara Jade. We want Mara Jade to be, to do all the things that were the potentialities of Leia, and we want to see this character be the Han Solo of the next series. So that sort of dynamic going on between the women that and Steve was just taking notes, and I'll get all this back into the system. So there was that's another thing. I mean, that was unique about Star Wars is that they had this interaction between the fans and the the franchise, as it were, collaborating to take this thing forward. And I think the inspiration of the story group before it was sold to Disney is that's how they would do it with Pablo Hidalgo and Leland Chee. I mean, the keeper of the holograms.
Holocron.
The holocron rather. And so all the deconfliction and the continuity and stuff would be sort of taken on, and to me the Pablo and Leland are two great examples of folks that grew up with Star Wars, and so they would be wonderful to husband this thing into the next generation.
I always saw Pablo walking around in the hallways, and he seemed just like the sweetest dude.
And his wife Kristen. My daughter, when she was doing a lot of work with the conventions and what have you, got very tight with her, and she stayed with them in San Francisco at one point for the purposes of having them take her around the headquarters. So they took her under their wing, and great people, and Leland as well. I mean, so I think George had in place a wonderful segue into your generation, right?
Right.
To carry this thing forward as sort of a as the mythos of our time.
Right. Yeah. I grew up with that. I grew up the 3 anime Clone Wars, so I did kind of want to lead that into second to last question, which is, have you had a chance to interact with Dave Filoni, who, in a lot of ways, is kind of, came from the animation world, worked in Avatar first and many other shows, then kind of said in a lot of ways too, starting 2008, and before that a little bit, that he kind of took up the role of Lucas's apprentice, right? He was starting to imbue him with all those same ideas that he had worked with, and I got a chance to really speak and interact with him at the last day at the company too. But where do you see that sort of direction, kind of going? Have you had a chance to interact with Dave and just,
Dave Filoni, yes. I met him very briefly at the Celebration Europe 2 in Essen when he was there. And we talked for a little bit because I was there with part of the Fets. We did the 4 Fets, and then Tim joined us. And so the rollout, if you will, of the Boba Fetts that were all involved, it was Daniel, Logan, and Jeremy, and myself, and Dickie Beer. And then Tim joined us on the stage with Warwick Davis. And so after that, when we were in the green room, Dave came in and we chatted a little bit about Rebels, which was being discussed, and they were setting up for that. And I will be honest, I was sort of hopeful that he might, consider bringing me in some ways to voice, a character, since it was all set at the time, just prior to Hobbs. The answer to that was no, we're not going to that.
Cameras are rolling right now, so I mean.
Well, anyway. But but that was, we're talking 2013.
2014, yeah.
Yeah, it was, but no, I haven't had any dealings with him or Lucasfilm since. And it has gone in a different direction. They're not bringing back the old people necessarily.
What are your hopes? Yeah, that was my last question.
Yeah, I really don't know where it's going. I think what Dave and Jon Favreau are doing with the Mandalorian is just fantastic. I'm a little concerned that that vision that I think was accurate with the how they would use the story group. The idea of filmmaking by committee, I think, can work, because I think the Filoni and Pablo and Leland and those that came out of Lucasfilm certainly, artistically, would have that full understanding of the vision that George had put forward. But the more inputs that are coming from Disney, might deflect it a little bit and break down, I think, the way forward, so that the commercial decisions become to predominate, and I think that could be damaging. And if they can arrive at the very thing that you were saying of commerce and art being in balance, then I think it can all be very promising. I love the production values that The Mandalorian has, and the way that they're using the LED stuff for the special effects, especially in that the actors are able to walk into these places and see
So for reference, he's talking about the fact that a room like this is just filled with LED screens.
Yeah.
And the whole background becomes the environment that you're in. So as opposed to back when you were working, which was a lot
just
of
a blue screen.
Yeah. You can see exactly where you are and what you're interacting with, and the creature off in the distance, right? And you have something much more active to work with.
Yeah. And I think the folks that are imagining those settings. I mean, for example, the planet that was where the Mon Calamari was my favorite, of just seeing that crash landing, pierside.
Yeah.
And just looking in the distance and seeing these cranes that are sort of a cross between contemporary container port and the AT-ATs. I mean, it's very cool.
Right.
Now, what I think is interesting about Star Wars is that it it creates this sort of Arthurian, if you will, mythology in our time that looks to, outer space, so that your imagination and my imagination and your imagination is focused on where humankind is going in your lifetime, in the lifetime of your children and your grandchildren, into the 22nd century. And enabling you all to think in terms of, what is right and what is wrong in those contexts, rather than backwards, and trying to say, well, what relevance does King Arthur have to, my life today? I mean, it's a contemporary mythos that has relevance to the future.
Yeah.
So this space opera that we're all talking about potentially could be really, exciting and maintain its relevance, I think.
Yeah.
And that is really exciting. For example, I mean, if you let me go on, several weeks ago I did a convention in Brownsville, Texas, and I didn't know very much about Brownsville, Texas. Well, as soon as I arrived, everybody's talking about Elon Musk, and he's transforming that place with his SpaceX, and he's kind of like, in some ways, the Prince Henry, the navigator of this era. And what he wants to do is turn SpaceX and Brownsville into New York City, so that if you want to go and mine an asteroid and it's 2040, you're not going to New York, you're going to Brownsville. And he's got no competition down there.
Right, true. Yeah.
It is absolutely fascinating. So what's going to provide the vision for the people that are going to be part of that? Well, Star Wars can,
Yeah. I mean,
because with all the stories that are going out right now about UFOs and whatever, we're going to find things out there, and they may be Wookiees. You see where I'm going?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Star Wars, I think, is going to have relevance.
Keep our imagination alive, and that's
now
really
you could say, well, does Star Trek do that? I mean, surely Star Trek does that, and I don't know. Does Star Trek have today, as a franchise, the same kind of fan base aspects?
Yeah.
Not as much.
Yeah. Doesn't have that same string.
And what is wonderful is when you meet these people that are out there that are costuming and doing good work for Make-A-Wish and what have you, and then you meet these other people like I just met today, that are droid builders.
Yeah.
I mean, it enables this cross-fertilization that just, keeps everybody charged.
Mm-hmm.
It's fabulous, and I'm just sort of thrilled to be a part of it anyway.
Excellent. Yeah, well, thank you so much.
You
for
wanted
your time,
the deal, you got it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This went on, and we hit a lot of great beats, honestly,
We did.
throughout this interview. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Preston,
Really
good luck to
appreciate
you,
it.
man.
Thank
As
you.
they say, break a leg.
Right? In this business, right?
Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you guys for taking the time to watch this episode. It was a lot of depth, we went 45 minutes, and I'm surprised my Zoom didn't die. It's about to die, so.
Battery almost died.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you on the next episode. Okay?
All right.
Have a good one.
All right, may the force be with you.
May the force be with you.
Jeez.